As Gareknar walked to class, she kept her ears down low, a far cry from what you'd expect from such a proud species as hers. The Forced always stood tall with their ears straight up to the sky to show their dominance to those around them. But now, she had her ears down and her head a little lower along with her shoulders, knowing that she had lost to the humans. Along with that, all those in the academy were not letting her forget it. As she walked down the hall, many students snickered and sometimes pointed their appendages towards her. Every once in a while, she would be able to knock her arm into one of the tentacles that might be her way, maybe a talon or whatnot. Anything to make sure she went to class, but did not catch as much of the trouble as she had. Many of the smaller species had even started to disrespect her a little bit, but she realized that she didn't have standing to really throw her voice around much. She was still, truly, the tallest and largest species in the entire school, which is one of the reasons why the Forced were able to come in such numbers. That being said, it wasn't long before she reached her classroom and tried to find a place to sit down. She looked over and she saw two of the humans over off the side. As they would converse to themselves, she couldn't hear what they were saying, but she assumed they were making fun of her. One of them simply turned, looked at her, and simply raised his jaw slightly, and then went back to talking with his friend. She didn't quite understand this gesture. Must be a human thing, she thought. And then she sat down. Next to her sat a strange insectoid mix between insectoid and lizard. As it sat down next to her, this Vunchen was not going to be kind. The Vunchen, barely standing 2/3 of a Forced height, or roughly chest height to a human, sat there quietly for a little while, waiting for class to start. However, eventually couldn't keep her trap shut. She began to slap her mandibles together in a way of kind of chuckling. Her antennae also moved sideways, enough that even her scales were slapped. For something that was so insectoid, it had a surprisingly high amount of scales, which is why the humans couldn't figure out whether to call it reptilian or insectoid. But that didn't seem to matter. Gregnar just kept her head down and didn't pay any mind as the lizard continued to laugh, and then subtle hints. I can't believe you lost. You lost a Forced lost. Oh, Alpha Force lost. Alpha Force sad. Alpha Force lost a primate. Ooh, sad. Alpha and mate lost a primate. Ooh, tagged in. Ooh, tagged. Ooh, they hit there. Oh, can't sit down. Trouble sitting down. And it just kept going. And she began to raise her voice even higher as more and more students came in, many of which pretended not to hear the verbal insults that were coming over, as they knew fighting inside the school was against any rules, of course, and they knew that they were being videoed. It was always a thing to say something sly to a Forced, but you knew eventually you would be challenged out in the arena against them. So it was a bad idea to really push your luck, but now they believed that the Forced had shown that they are actually weak, as humans were still not considered to be all that strong. In comparison, this Vunchen, even a female Vunchen, was easily able to overpower a human male, at least a standard human male. It was found out fairly quick along that human males tend to exercise vigorously, and if they do so, they tend to grow stronger and faster and more flexible. This third portion was considered more of a joke amongst the females inside the academy, as many of them mated by wrapping themselves around each other and contorting themselves in different directions. This, in some cases, made them wonder if humans were strong enough to face off against a group of Forced, and win. Then perhaps, just maybe, they would be worth integrating into their own biome, bringing them into their own nest, and bringing them into their own genetics. Possibly. And with this, the Vornchan female continued. Maybe mate with human male. Maybe human male offspring be better for Forced. Maybe then Forced would be able to beat human male. Maybe then didn't even get to finish the sentence as a hand, a very strong and powerful hand, landed on the shoulder of the Vunshin. The Vunshin turned and looked up, realizing that this hand had landed with a lot of force, and began to squeeze, definitely getting the attention. The Vunshin realizing if it had a carapace, it would most likely be cracking at this time. It looked up and it saw the blue eyes of one of the humans that had walked over. This strange human simply stared at it. Didn't have any fur on its face or much of its body. Some small hairs down its arms, but it didn't really show anything. Also, there was a bunch of hair on top of its head, which many believed was similar to the forced, as the males themselves grow a type of mane down their backs. This is to show that they are strong and that they have developed into a strong alpha male themselves, though very few males actually get to this point. Many could consider it like a silverback gorilla. Not all males actually get to this point. But when they do, look out. The Vortian looked up. Why stop me, human? The man just looked down. That's enough. The Vortian stood up and looked the human in the eye. Though the Vortian only stood up again chest level, it knew that if it stood up and faced against the human, it could most likely beat it in a physical confrontation. The human simply looked down and said, "That is enough. You can knock this bullshit off." Of course, that last part didn't quite translate correctly, as all they heard was bovine excrement. The Vorst looked confused, not nearly as confused as Greknar, who had been looking up from her position, still with her ears back, but now her ears began to perk up, trying to figure out why this human was protecting her. Why was a human who had faced off against them willing to put themselves in danger? A Vunshin has very strong upper body strength and could easily punch through a human if it truly got ready and hit with as much force as it possibly could. Yet the human stood defiant in front of her. "Human, we just having fun, talking. You no have to deal with any of this. Does not concern. Understand?" Without skipping a beat, the human looked down, bent down a little closer. "No, you understand. This conversation is over. Or do you want to face us in the arena next time? And I'll tell you what, I'm not going to stop at one shot unless you knock it off." The Vortian was somewhat confused at it, but understood the message. And with that, simply turned and walked away, nudging its half-carapaced arm against the human on the way by, causing a small scrape, but not enough to cause any damage. The human himself stood there, with a small amount of red blood beginning to show on its arm. The human looked down, simply wiped it with his hand, and checked to see how much blood there was. And with that, he looked down to Greknar, and she looked up at him. Being as big as she was, she almost didn't have to stand up to look him almost directly into the eyes. He simply stuck his hand out and said, "I never did introduce myself. The name's Larry." She realized this was a human concept of actually grabbing forearms, but she didn't quite get it, but she would follow the protocol. She simply grasped his hand and could actually see a small tinge of pain as she squeezed it. He simply raised his hand, dropped it really quick, and then released his hand, but she didn't release hers. It took her a moment before she realized she was supposed to let go. She didn't realize that she had left a small bruise on his hand, but he didn't let it show. "Why did you protect me? Aren't we adversaries here, trying to make the top spot? You didn't have to do that." Without skipping a beat, Larry simply stood straight up. "It's in our nature to protect, and that little bitch was being a total asshole. You didn't deserve that. You guys did just fine out there." Greknar was surprised at this, and she actually found herself cooing a little bit as she realized that this human was a whole lot nicer, yet so violent out in the field and such good predators. How could a human do this? How could they change so much? She didn't understand. And Larry simply walked away, and said, "All right, I'll see you." Gregnar watched him as he walked all the way back to his friend, and they sat down and began to converse. She wanted to say something. The professor then walked in, and class began. She wouldn't talk to him again for almost an entire week. Well, their week of 8 days. At the end of that, she saw the human again as he passed by for class, but all he received from her was a simple movement of the jaw, the same thing he had given to her. And he simply said, "Hey," and moved his hand in a waving motion as he went by. She was still interested in this. She went by and sniffed the air a little bit as he went through. She liked the smell. Oh, why did the humans smell so good all of a sudden? She couldn't figure it out at first. She continued to go along, and she did see Larry's friend, and she sniffed the air behind him. Yet she didn't get a good whiff of him, as he was with a different type of alien. A small, hairless Nishani, a bluish humanoid with gills, clearly aquatic, but clearly they had some sort of relationship, as he had his arm around her. Ragnar didn't even think twice about it and continued to go around, and then 2 days later she saw Larry again. This time, he was having his lunch by himself. So she simply walked up and introduced herself again and sat down with him, and they began to converse. As they conversed, he asked many, many questions about her, her family, her planet. He had already read much of the data on them, but knowing something firsthand, or in this case from the firsthand knowledge, was better than anything you would find in any textbook, that's for damn sure. With that, they continued to talk long after their meal had finished. Though as they did, they didn't realize they were getting a lot of strange looks around. Seeing a Vorst and a human together was completely just odd. The two most dangerous, as they figured out, seemingly getting along. This was worrisome. I mean, it is what the Academy was for, but still worrisome. Usually, the more dangerous a predator species, the more they stay away from other predator species, as you don't want a fight to break out. If it is, the worst that could happen is someone dies. The best is you get kicked out of the Academy. Neither one was something either of them wanted to deal with. Yet they seemed to be laughing and having a good time. That is until a Zeknakel showed up. This tall reptile was only a few centimeters shy of how tall a Forst is. Greknar looked up at this reptile as it came up. It seemed to want to get their attention. Instead of coughing, it hissed at them. This immediately made Larry very nervous, as they didn't realize that this was going to be some sort of threat. Larry immediately grabbed a knife and went into a defensive position, as the Zeknekel stood right next to them. The reptile looked confused, and it simply said, "Relax, human. I am not here to fight you, at least not now. I was wondering if you and your other human friends would indulge us in a trip into the forest. We would like to face off against you." Larry looked confused and said, "You want to go into the arena against us?" "Not the arena that you know. Another arena. The bigger arena." Greknar injected, "That is for higher level students. We have not reached grades high enough to use that." "It will be okay. I will make sure of that." Larry simply reached over and drank the last of his liquids and said, "All right, tell you what, you get permission from the teaching staff, signed by the Chancellor herself, and we'll do this." "Excellent, human. I promise you will not make it as easy through as you face this weak force right here." With that, Gregnar was about to stand up, but she didn't have time, as the human jumped to his feet and immediately walked over and stood right in front of the Zeknekel. "You want to say that one again?" he said. Again, Greknar felt a flush of heat go through her body as she saw Larry standing there looking up at this reptile. Though she realized that the human had a strength advantage, these reptiles were known for their blinding speed. Not to mention, the males tended to have a paralytic compound inside their fangs, so if he bit into Larry, well, it wouldn't be more than a minute before Larry was on the ground, immobile. This would be bad, just simply bad. But it seemed as though Larry didn't care. As they two faced off, the Zeknekel simply motioned a little bit with his tail, and then two more showed up, one on either side. Before they even had a chance to even show their numbers too much, they heard, "Hey, can anybody else join this party?" They turned around and there was another human, the one that Larry was talking to before. Larry goes, "Hey, Vince, good to see you. I don't think it's time to dance now. I don't hear the music, but this fella here says he wants to take us on inside the big arena." "The big arena? We're not high enough class to do that." "Well, he says he can get the arena for us." "Sign for?" "Yep." "Cool. I'd be interested to take down these, what are these guys again?" "Zeknekel," they said without hesitation, all three of them hissing over their shoulder. "Right, that. Well, for right now, you just kind of look like human-shaped iguanas to me, so how about this? You get on my buddy's face, you go get that paperwork, and we'll settle this the right way. How's that sound?" "Sounds lovely." He simply turned and walked away. The humans came together, Vince walking up to Larry with a full tray. "What the hell was that about?" "Oh, more species trying to be dominant, I guess." "Oh boy, and the big arena too, huh?" "Yeah, big arena." "Oh, this is gonna be interesting." They looked over and they sat down with Greknar as she berated them for what they had done. "You didn't have to protect me. I can protect myself." 3-1? Yeah, okay. As strong as they can be, only one nip and you're down on the ground anyway. I wouldn't want to know what one of them was going to do to a female once they paralyzed her. We already heard what they do to their females during the mating season. It's, doesn't sit right to us." "Damn straight," Larry added on to what Vince had said. "Well, and with that, Greknar again felt a flush of heat go from the tip of her nose to the tip of her tail, and immediately excused herself, claiming that something was off. She didn't feel quite right. The two sat there and talked for a minute and joked and were laughing when she left the room. She immediately went into her own quarters and tried to figure out if she was coming down with some sort of virus. Maybe the humans had given them one of their viruses. No, that couldn't be it. That couldn't possibly be it. Everyone's been cleansed of viruses. Viruses aren't a thing here. What's going? Whatever. Maybe I'll check for bacterial infection. She immediately went and checked her blood. A week later, everyone was getting ready to watch the fight in the arena. They could see that the humans had brought their 4 men out again, but this time they were going to have friends. As the 4 stood there in those strange suits getting ready to walk out, they saw that 4 more were going to join them. This was going to be interesting. The Zeknekel brought 30 of their own. They believed that they would be able to just run them over by numbers, and the humans realized this. The humans, realizing that the larger arena was several hundreds of kilometers in radius, let alone diameter, believed they came up with a better idea. Eventually, everyone took their positions, and the buzzer sounded. And by buzzer, I mean they launched a firework into the sky, and everyone saw it. The rules were simple. You could only move during the day, as it was too dangerous at night, as only certain species were able to see well at night. Once night fell, an alarm would sound, allowing everyone to simply stop where they were, condense their forces if they wished, but they could not advance in the direction they were going anymore. They could fall back, but they couldn't advance. They could simply make their own rations, and then they would move on. Sounds simple enough. Allowing everyone to get a good night's sleep allowed for more action to happen the next day. Not to mention you didn't want this to last too long, or anybody to accidentally get hurt in the dark, as the retrieval crew would have much more difficulty getting an injured student out. The Zeknekel got online, spread themselves out approximately 75 to 120 meters away from each other, and began to sweep the area. As they moved closer to where they believed the humans were, they began to sniff the air, taste the air with their tongues even, looking around. Their eyes, those strange reptilian eyes, began to open and close that strange iris, as though they seemed to be analyzing every piece of brush, everything around them, as they moved closer and closer to where the humans were. They moved with delicate grace. Given their size, this was incredible. Each of them holding the strange paint gun in their hands as they moved more and more and more, constantly using hand signals that they picked up from the humans as they moved up, and it would take them more than a day for them to get close enough to the humans that they could strike. So they waited that night. That night they laughed as they realized that it would be a slightly chilly night, and then they realized that they wished they had brought more gear. They didn't have much, as they would end up having to basically curl up onto each other, a few of them cursing as they did so, as there was no females in their group. They couldn't stay warm, as they said it, the old-fashioned way, though that didn't stop a couple of them from trying. All in all, not many of them actually got much sleep that night, as the anticipation, excitement, and a few of them deciding to do something crazy kept most of them up all night. They moved out at first light as soon as the alarm bell went. As they got closer to where they believed the humans were, they fanned out even more, keeping their weapons up and moving, constantly moving up, as they realized they caught the scent of human, but they were still a long way off. They moved up even more and more, closer and closer, believing they had found their way closer to the humans, but they didn't find anything. They believed they could smell the humans. They must be close. Where were they? The humans should have been around here. They should have moved towards them. But where were they? This doesn't make sense. They didn't hear any of the weapons go off. They didn't have any of their people cry in pain. They didn't have any of that. Where were they? Were they in the trees? They looked up. No, not in the trees. Were they on the ground? They looked around. No. They again flicked their tongues and smelled through the air to see if they could find them. And they could smell human. They knew humans were around. But they didn't hear anything. They didn't see anything. They could just smell them. It would take another day of walking before they finally got to where the human starting point was. And all they found was nothing. There was nothing there, but they could still smell that human was in the air somewhere. They were around, they just couldn't see them. They couldn't tell where they were. They didn't have any electronics to find any heat signature, as if they needed it. The reptilians themselves could actually sense heat within about 75 meters, which is why they were spread out at the distance they were, which was very smart. But they couldn't sense the heat. Nothing except a couple of simple native squirrels and things of that nature. They didn't know what was going on, and they continued to move, but many of them kept complaining that they needed a break. They needed to stop. But this wasn't time. They continued to move up for the entire day. This would be 3 days. They did nothing but trudge forward through thick vegetation, and they continued to go more and more and more, and they eventually, by the end of that day, found a camping spot. Dead ashes were in a fire pit, surrounded by a level area. This must be where the humans stayed. They checked around and thought maybe this was an ambush. They checked all until they heard the buzzer go off, and now they had to stop. They decided to use the humans' campsite. The humans wouldn't be moving. They weren't allowed to, and everyone was being monitored, so they decided to stay there. They relit the fire, stayed warmer that night as they kept the fire going, but many of them kept complaining how they could not get to sleep because they had to stay up on guard. They wanted to make sure nothing snuck up at night. There were, of course, critters, one of which was unlucky enough to get too close, and one of the Zeknekel decided to go in for the kill, and succeeded. They didn't have to do much, grabbing the critter by the leg and giving a quick nip before letting it go. The creature itself, similar to that of a rabbit, only got about another 50 meters before it simply started to wobble as though it was drunk off its ass and then simply stop and fall over. Many were glad that there was no video, as the Zeknekel were known for tearing their food apart while it was still alive. It was well noted that their parasitic saliva was able to knock something out to make it so it couldn't move, but you could still feel, you could still see, you could still hear, and that was a bad way to go. The next morning, even more exhausted, the Zeknekel got up and continued to follow the scent of human. They had to trudge through deeper and deeper forest, many of them having to climb over and under and through trees, through shrubs. Many of them had spikes on them. That did not feel good, as the Zeknekel did not wear much in the way of clothing at all. They believed their hide was thick enough to deal with things, but some of the flora on this planet was just sharp. Many of them were bleeding and were contemplating calling for a medical evac, which would essentially take them out of the game itself. But they continued to go. They kept moving more and more, many of them beginning to complain so much that they needed to stop, they needed to break. But their leader continued to force them over, believing this was a sense of pride to take down those that have taken down the Forced. The Forced were the only ones that ever gave the Zeknekel a run for their money. Each side would usually charge at each other. The only difference was the Forced were able to maneuver a little better. They were able to blend in just a little bit more, and they could see just a little bit farther. This gave them just the slightest of advantage, along with the ability to smash into a tree and knock it over. The Zeknekel, as strong as they were, wouldn't survive a tree landing on them. This was just common practice whenever they faced off against the Forced, and they did not want this to happen again. They did not want to be caught in one position, because that is exactly what would happen. So they continued. By the end of the fourth day, they just couldn't keep going. Many of them huddled around an area. They couldn't get a fire going. They had nothing to start it with. The only reason they were able to actually start the human's fire is they found something the human called matches, which turned out to be sulfur and magnesium on the end of a piece of wood that was able to actually ignite. They were grateful that this was left for them. Or did they find it? The leader was confused. What was this? Was this sympathy? No. What was this? Why were they not finding the humans? They were following the scent. They didn't have to worry, though. They would find them the next day. By the end of the fifth day, many of them had just run out of gas. They were done. Their legs screamed at them, many of them walking on all fours, even though they were still sensing the air, looking for heat signatures. They were simply just worn out. They couldn't keep going, and many of them just sat up against trees. No matter how much their leader said that their families would be disgraced, they didn't care anymore. They simply said they were done. Whatever. The Zeknekel leader took the remainder of his and kept moving. Eventually, he would wait for them when the day ended. But when the day ended, they stopped again. But their fall-behinds never caught up. They didn't realize anything had happened. More and more Zeknekel fell out, more and more the next day. So much so that the leader, even though his muscles screamed at him that he needed to stop, his joints were begging for him to stop moving forward. His pride pushed him forward with the most loyal of his friends, down to about 8, not actually including himself, which meant there was 9. Now it was an even playing field between the humans and them. The leader of the Zeknekel was still wondering why his fall-behinds had not caught up. How did they fall out and not catch up already? They were going so slow. After a night's rest, they should have been able to catch up. Where were they? Why did they not catch up? Eventually, they were down to almost nothing. He only had 3 of his own. Many of those had just fallen behind, and they had gotten to the point where they were barely 10 feet apart from each other, still barely making it through the bush. And that is when the leader realized something. He pulled out a map. They were able to have them, and he started to check the distant mountains to see where he was. Though land navigation was not his strong suit, one of his subordinates it was. They looked and they realized what had happened. They had started to go around in circles. They couldn't believe it until they started to move once again. This time, by the end of the day, they found themselves back at the original human campsite. How? What? And sitting right next to the fire pit that was full of fresh wood was a small book of matches. The leader couldn't believe what the hell was going on. He didn't know. He was trying to figure it out. How could they chase the humans for 5, 6, 7 days? He didn't even know at this point. He just wanted to find one. He wanted to stick his fangs in and to knock that stupid grin off the human's face, knock the defiance out of his eyes. Anything at all to show that the Forced were not the baddest. They were easily beaten by the humans, and if they could take down the humans, they would be the top ones out there. They would be the only ones that could ever be considered dominant, especially in the academy. That is all that mattered to the leader now. He needed to do this. As he woke up the next morning, he looked at his final compatriots. When they woke up, they all stood up and realized, with the exception of the leader, they all had pink goo on their chest and on their necks. They all looked at each other confused and started screaming, "How? What? Who did this? I didn't get shot. How? What? Huh?" And they realized as they looked up that half the day had gone by. The sun was already overhead. It was noon. How in the ever-loving crap did this happen? How did they sleep through the morning? And then it hit them. They were so exhausted that they slept through the morning alarms. The humans must have found them, but why did they leave the leader untouched? The rest of them simply pulled out from their small little bag that small red cloth, the symbol that they had been taken out, and began to walk the long way to the extraction point. They knew that once the game was over, VTOLs would be scrambled to pick them all up, but they still had to leave the area. They didn't have a choice. What was going on? The leader looked around, left, right, and eventually his eyes saw something hanging from a tree. He looked over, and a strange piece of plastic was hanging there. It was a long piece that was a bright yellow. It was strange. It was almost like this thing the humans call a belt. It was very similar to, well, they didn't call it a belt in his culture. They called it a schneid. But that was around his waist as well. Did the humans leave this here to mark their territory? He walked over close to it and began to sniff. It sure smelled human, and it smelled fresh. And as he reached up to grab it, maybe he can just have a trophy from this. He just simply heard, "Fire!" And suddenly he dropped onto his back as 8 different rounds of paint caught him in every single direction around his tail, and down he went like a sack of shit, screeching in pain, so much so that even those that had been taken out before ran back to see if he was okay. And as they did, they began to run up and they saw him on the ground, screeching as he grabbed onto his tail. As they screamed for their leader, suddenly they stopped and realized that humans had wrapped their arms around them and put those paint blades right up to their throat. Without skipping a beat, they heard, "Sweetheart, you're already dead. Don't make me kill you twice." the Zekneckles turned and looked, and sure enough, humans had simply come out of the foliage and jumped up on them. If these had been real blades and real bullets, none of them would have survived. And with that, the Zekneckle felt fear and began to shake. Calm down, sweetheart. Go to the extraction point, and we won't have a problem. With that, the Zekneckle left their leader as he was on the ground, still screeching, as the impact had caused his nerve endings to stop, and he was unable to actually land on his backside just because of all the hits. He realized this was a set of poetic justice as he saw a single human walk out of the foliage and into the open area. It walked right up to the leader. And as the leader looked at him with complete and total hatred in his eyes, the human simply reached over and grabbed his PT belt, pulled it off the limb, rolled it up, put it in his pocket, and simply walked over and stood over the leader. As he did, the cannon firing, signifying that the game was over, went off. With that, almost instantly, they could hear VTOLs in the distance. Larry stood over the leader and said, "You know, if you weren't such an asshole, you wouldn't have got shot in your... yeah." The leader suddenly realized what he had done. He had completely caught into their trap. But as he rolled on the ground, trying desperately not to land on any spot that he had got plugged in, he simply turned to the human that was walking around and screamed, "How did you stay ahead of us? We charged through for days. How did you do that? You're ambush predators." Larry stopped and turned around with a confused look at, "Who the fuck said we were ambush predators?" And he could hear laughter coming from behind him where all the humans were. "No, we're not ambush predators, pal. We're persistent predators. We'll keep going until whatever we're hunting keels over and can't get back up. We don't need venom. We don't need paralytic agents. We don't need any of that shit." "But you ambushed the Vorscht. But it doesn't make sense. How can... Ow!" He tried to finish the sentence, but had rolled back onto his tail and immediately felt the shock go right up his spine. Larry simply grinned and said, "Well, see, that's your problem. You guys, you find a tactic you like and you just go for it. Makes you predictable." With that, he simply turned away from the leader and walked towards the foliage. The leader was still trying to stand up, but his legs didn't want to work, neither did his tail, and he suddenly realized that he had lost control of his bodily functions as the nerve endings had been pinched so hard by all the impacts that he had realized he had crapped right down his leg and his tail, a complete embarrassment for his species. As he grabbed some foliage to try and wipe and cleanse himself, he heard from the forest, "Oh, by the way, leave my friends alone." With that, the leader simply looked, and he could hear movement, but he couldn't see anything. The humans had simply disappeared like ghosts. Watching on the monitor, Greknar looked over at Larry and had seen the majority of what he had said, especially that thing about leaving his friends alone. She looked more over at him, at his picture, at his three-dimensional readout that was on her screen, and she realized that the flush of heat she had found was simply that. Somehow, she had gone into heat over a human. This thought kind of made her cringe a bit as she realized she had been attracted to a hairless ape. She was even interested in that, but the thought just made her shudder at the idea of having him on top and being the sire to her children. She worried about this and then thought to herself with sudden horror, what if Father wants their genetic code in our bloodline? Oh shit. A few days later, she decided to talk to Vince and just try and figure out if Larry would be interested. She brought up her concerns slightly in front of Vince and his Nashini girlfriend, and this made Vince laugh. Hysterically belly laugh. She wanted to know what was so funny, as Gretnar still did not like it when people laughed at her. She understood her humility, of course, but she did not enjoy it in the slightest. As Vince finally got his wits about him, he simply slowed down. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry. Let me just say this. As he motioned up and down her body, your species is more feline, my dear. And simply, he tried to leave it at that. And Gretnar Simon said, "So, could you expound on that?" "Well, I'm sorry, my dear, but we human males are very visually attracted to things that are much more closer to our human females. And you are not exactly the type of pussy we would be interested in." Gretnar was relieved at the same time that she was a little upset at the realization, and she simply asked, "Is there anything I could do to change that?" "Well, my dear, have you ever heard of CRISPR?"